The morning they put Anna Vaughn on the auction block, the sky over Caldwell, Kansas was the color of a fresh bruise, purple and low, and pressing down on the rooftops like a hand that meant to hold something in place. It was the spring of 1879, and the town of Caldwell sat right on the edge of the Kishom Trail, a place where cattle, money, and desperation moved through in equal measure, where men arrived rich and left broke, or arrived broke and left with someone else's dignity. The wind never stopped blowing in Caldwell. It came up from the Indian Territory to the south, and it carried dust and the smell of cattle and sometimes, on the worst days, the particular silence that follows a thing that cannot be taken back. Anna had not chosen to be there. She wanted to be perfectly clear about that, at least to herself, because nobody else seemed to care one way or the other. She stood at the edge of the platform that Cyrus Dodd, the town's self-appointed land assessor and collector of debts, had erected in front of the grain exchange building on Main Street. It was a Sunday, which struck Anna as deeply wrong, though she had lost the will to say so out loud. She was 28 years old and she had been a widow for 6 months. Her husband, Thomas Vaughn, had died of a fever in October, and the fever had been cruel enough to take him fast, but not fast enough to let him set their affairs in order first. What it left behind was a farm of 160 acres on the western edge of the county, a mule named George who bit strangers, 2 milk cows, a debt of $432 to the Caldwell Bank and Trust, and Anna herself, who was none of these things' fault. The bank had been patient for exactly the amount of time required by law and not 1 day longer. Then Cyrus Dodd had arrived at her door with 2 men she had never seen before, and a piece of paper she read 3 times because she could not quite believe what it said. The paper said that, in lieu of cash payment of the outstanding debt, her labor and service as a domestic worker could be contracted to a willing party for a period not to exceed 3 years, during which the debt would be considered satisfied. It was a legal arrangement that had been used in the territory before, a thing that existed in the gray space between what was written and what was right, and it made Anna's hands shake so badly she had to set the paper down on the table. She had no family in Kansas. Her parents were in Ohio, her mother ill, her father too old to make the journey west. She had written letters that autumn and received letters back full of love and sorrow and no money. Thomas's brother lived in Colorado and had his own struggles. There was no one to come riding in. There was no one to send. So she had stood in her farmhouse kitchen that March morning and looked at Cyrus Dodd's pale, careful face and understood that she had run out of road. The people of Caldwell came to watch because people always came to watch. She could not entirely blame them. It was a small town and drama was scarce, and this was drama dressed up as administration. She recognized most of their faces. There was Margaret Holt from the dry goods store, who had always been kind to Anna and who now stood with her arms crossed and her expression troubled, as though she wanted to intervene but had not yet figured out how. There was Pastor Greer, who held his hat in his hands and looked at the ground. There was Deputy Ames, who was not quite looking at anything. What there was not was a great deal of noise. That was the thing Anna would remember later, the quiet of it. The crowd did not jeer or call out. They watched in that particular Western silence that was not respect so much as a shared understanding that what was happening was uncomfortable, and no one wanted to be the one to name it plainly. Cyrus Dodd climbed the 3 steps to the platform and cleared his throat. He was a thin man with excellent posture, and the manners of someone who had studied manners from a book rather than practiced them with actual people. He unfolded a paper and read from it. The contract of service for one Anna Mary Vaughn, widow, age 28 years, of reasonable health and sound mind, capable of domestic labor including cooking, cleaning, laundry, and the management of household accounts, is hereby offered by public tender. The successful bidder will receive 3 years of said service in exchange for the assumption of the debt of $432 currently held against the late Thomas Vaughn's estate. Bidding will begin at $300. Anna kept her eyes on the horizon. She had decided that morning, standing in front of the small mirror in her bedroom, that she would not look at the crowd. She would look past them, at the flat line where the Kansas prairie met the sky, and she would think of nothing in particular, and she would get through this the way she had gotten through the worst nights of Thomas's illness, and the way she had gotten through the funeral, and the way she had gotten through every hard thing in her life, by putting one moment in front of the other until enough of them had passed. She was wearing her dark blue dress, the good one, because she had thought it was important to appear composed. Her hair was pinned neatly. She held her hands together in front of her, not wringing them, just holding them, giving them something to do. The silence stretched. Nobody bid. Dodd cleared his throat again. $300 for 3 years of domestic service. A fair arrangement by any measure. Still nothing. Anna felt the silence change in character, felt it go from uncomfortable to something closer to embarrassing, and she could not tell whether the embarrassment was for her or for the men who stood in the crowd and looked at their boots. She was about to decide that it would be the whole situation that embarrassed her, the whole flattening weight of it, when a voice came from the back of the crowd. It was not a loud voice. It was not the voice of a man who needed volume to make himself heard. It was low and even, and it carried the way a rifle shot carries, not by force but by precision. $432, the voice said. The full amount. Anna turned her head, which was the first time she had moved since climbing the steps. The man standing at the back of the crowd was not remarkable in any way that announced itself. He was tall, but not ostentatiously so. He wore a dark coat that had seen serious use and a hat with a straight brim. He was perhaps 35, perhaps a year or two more or less. The kind of face that weather and purpose had shaped into something that did not give away its exact age easily. He had dark eyes and a jaw that looked as though it had never done anything without intention. He had not pushed forward through the crowd. He stood exactly where he was, and he had not raised his voice, and the crowd had parted slightly around him the way people part around something they can feel the gravity of without being able to name it. He was looking at Dodd, not at Anna. Cyrus Dodd blinked. "I'm sorry, sir, I did not catch your name." "Harlan Bishop," the man said. "I'll pay it today, the full amount." "Cash?" The crowd made a sound that was not quite murmuring and not quite silence, something in between, a recalibration. Dodd fumbled with his paper. "The successful bidder, Mr. Bishop, would be entitled to—" "I know what the paper says," Harlan Bishop said, still in that same unhurried voice. "I'm not contracting her service. I'm paying the debt. She owes the bank $432. I'll pay it. The debt is cleared. She goes home." There was a long pause during which Cyrus Dodd appeared to be working through whether what had just been proposed was possible within the framework of what he had erected, and slowly arriving at the conclusion that it was, in fact, entirely possible, and he had simply never considered it. Anna looked at the man at the back of the crowd and felt something move through her that was not gratitude exactly, though gratitude was part of it. It was closer to the sensation of a door opening in a room you had been certain was sealed. She had never seen Harlan Bishop before in her life. He paid the debt that afternoon at the Caldwell Bank and Trust, in cash, from a leather billfold that he produced without ceremony. Anna stood in the bank's small lobby and watched the teller count the bills twice, and when it was done and the debt ledger showed a zero balance and she was given back the deed to the farm and the papers for the estate, she stood outside on the boardwalk in the spring wind and did not know what to do with any of it. Harlan Bishop came out of the bank behind her, settled his hat, and was about to walk away when Anna turned around. "Mr. Bishop," she said. He stopped. He had a quality of stillness that she noticed for the first time, the way he could simply stop moving without any of the fidgeting or adjustment that most people performed. "You did not have to do that," she said. "No," he agreed. "I do not know you." "No," he said again. "I know." Then why, she asked, and she asked it plainly, without any of the performance of gratitude or the softening that the situation might have invited, because she genuinely wanted to understand and she had never had much patience for going around a question to get to it. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who did not have an answer, but the quiet of someone who was choosing how honest to be. "I knew Thomas," he finally said. "Not well. We worked the same cattle drive out of Texas 3 years ago before he settled here. He was a decent man and he talked about you the whole ride." Anna felt the back of her throat tighten in the way it still did when Thomas was invoked unexpectedly. She pressed her lips together for a moment. "He talked about you every time we made camp," Harlan said. "About the farm you were building. About how you'd made curtains for the windows before the walls were properly finished because you said it helped it feel like home. He was proud of you." She looked away at the street, at a wagon passing, at nothing specific. "I rode through Caldwell this week on my way north," Harlan said. "I heard what Dodd was doing. I could not ride past it." "You could have, though," Anna said, and there was something in her voice that was not accusation but close to it, because she had watched a great many people who could have stopped what had happened that morning and had chosen not to. "I could have," he said simply. "I didn't." He touched the brim of his hat, a small and correct gesture, and he walked away down the boardwalk in the direction of the livery. Anna stood there for a long moment with the farm deed in her hand and the wind taking at her hair, and tried to decide how she felt about Harlan Bishop. She could not quite decide. She put the papers in her coat pocket and walked toward the livery herself to get her horse, because she needed to get back to the farm before dark, and George the mule would need feeding regardless of how the day had gone. She had not expected to see Harlan Bishop again. Caldwell was a trail town. People moved through it the way water moved through a pipe, arriving and departing without particular attachment to the place itself. He had said he was on his way north. She assumed north was where he went. She was wrong. She discovered this the next morning when she came out of the farmhouse at 6 o'clock to find a man she did not immediately recognize crouched beside the broken lower hinge of her barn door, working at it with a wrench and a quiet competence that suggested he had been at it for some time. He stood when he heard her and she recognized him. "Mr. Bishop," she said. "Mrs. Vaughn." He had his coat off, working in his shirt sleeves despite the morning chill. "Your barn door has been dragging on the ground. If you leave it like that, the wood will rot at the corner in another season." Anna looked at the door, which had indeed been dragging since November, and which she had not had either the means or the energy to properly repair. Then she looked at Harlan Bishop. "I did not invite you to my property," she said, but she said it with more curiosity than coldness. "No," he said. "I saw it on my way past. I stopped." "You are on your way north," she said. "This farm is west of town." Something that might, on a different face, have been a smile moved briefly at the corner of his mouth. "I took the longer road." She looked at him for a moment. He looked back at her with the directness that she was beginning to understand was simply how he was, not a performance, not an attempt at anything, just the particular quality of a man who had no interest in pretending to be elsewhere when he was somewhere. "Have you had breakfast?" she asked. "No." "I'll make eggs," she said. "You can finish the door first." He finished the door in the time it took her to fry 4 eggs and slice the bread she had made 2 days ago and heat the coffee. He came in through the back door, washed his hands in the basin she had set out, and sat down at the kitchen table with the same absence of ceremony with which he seemed to do everything. They ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. "How long have you been ranching?" she asked, because she needed to understand who he was, and she had always found that occupation told you something reliable about a person. "I don't ranch," he said. "I train horses. I take contracts, ranchers, the army, whoever needs it. I go where the work is." "So you have no place of your own?" "Not yet," he said, and the way he said it carried the weight of a decision not yet made rather than a lack. "Where are you from?" "Missouri, originally. I left at 17. "Why?" He cut his bread and considered the question with the same careful attention he seemed to give to everything. "Because my father was the kind of man who used his hands wrong," he said, and I decided that I did not want to be where he was. Anna received this information and did not press it further. She understood the privacy of a wound and respected it. Thomas never mentioned you, she said. It was not an accusation, just an observation. He might not have, Harlan said. We were trail companions, not friends in the deep sense. We got along well and we trusted each other on the trail and we parted ways at the end of it. That's a kind of friendship too, I think, just a specific kind. She thought about that. Yes, she said. I think that's right. After breakfast, he helped her repair the fence along the north pasture, which had taken damage over the winter. She told him he did not have to, and he told her the fence needed doing, which was not the same as a refusal. They worked side by side through the morning, and Anna found that working alongside Harlan Bishop was an uncomplicated thing. He did not talk excessively or explain what he was doing or seek approval for his choices. He worked steadily and well and occasionally said something practical, and she found she liked that very much. She had not known how much she had missed the simple competence of another person beside her. That evening he thanked her for the breakfast and the use of her tools and rode back toward Caldwell. She watched him go from the porch and did not allow herself to think too carefully about whether she hoped he would come back. He came back the next day, and the day after that. By the end of the first week, she had begun to understand the shape of him in a different way, not just as the man who had paid her debt and quietly fixed her barn door, but as a particular kind of person she had not encountered before. He was a man of few words in the sense that he did not use words to fill space, but he was not a man of few thoughts. When he spoke it was because he had something to say, and what he said was nearly always worth hearing. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn the features of a landscape by walking through it rather than looking at a map. He had been in the Army for 2 years after leaving Missouri, had mustered out after an engagement near the Red River that he mentioned once and did not elaborate on. He had learned his horse work from an old Comanche man named Tosa who had worked briefly for a rancher outside Wichita and who had been, Harlan said, the finest horseman he had ever seen. He read when he could get books, which was not often. He drank moderately and played cards badly on purpose because he had found that men who lost at cards were more trusted than men who won. He slept in a room at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house in Caldwell, and he had not yet resumed his journey north. Anna did not ask him directly why he was still there. She thought about it, though. She thought about it in the evenings when the farm was quiet, and she sat on the porch with a cup of tea and watched the sun go down over the Kansas plain in that enormous, unapologetic way it had, filling the whole sky with color as though it owed the world something spectacular before it left. She was a woman who believed in practical thinking. She had always been practical. Thomas had loved that about her and had also, occasionally and affectionately, complained about it. She was practical now. She told herself that Harlan Bishop was a capable man who had done her an extraordinary kindness and was evidently a decent person, and that his continued presence at her farm was a neighborly thing, nothing more, nothing complicated, nothing to examine with too much care. She told herself this quite firmly on a Thursday evening in April when he had stayed late helping her mend the chicken coop, and she had made supper, and they had sat across from each other at the kitchen table talking about nothing in particular for 2 hours, and she had not noticed the time passing. She told herself it was nothing complicated when he reached across the table to turn the lantern wick up because the light had gotten low, and his hand brushed her wrist, and the touch was the most accidental, ordinary thing in the world, and her heart moved so quickly she nearly put her hand over it. She told herself a great many sensible things that did not entirely hold. It was Margaret Holt who said it plainly, because Margaret Holt had always been that way. Anna had come into town to buy flour and lamp oil on a Friday morning in late April, and Margaret had leaned over the counter at the dry goods store and said in her direct, unhurried way, "That man Harlan Bishop is eating breakfast at Ma Peterson's every morning and riding out your way every afternoon, and half this town has noticed." "He is helping with repairs," Anna said Margaret. "The farm needs a great deal of work," Anna said. "I'm sure it does," Margaret said, "and he is very helpful." Anna paid for the flour and the lamp oil and did not dignify the rest of it with a response, and walked out of the dry goods store into the bright April morning and stood on the boardwalk for a moment. The thing was, Margaret was not wrong. And the other thing, the thing that Anna had been stepping around for 2 weeks, was that Harlan Bishop looked at her the way a man looks at a woman when he is trying very hard not to look at her too much. She had noticed it. She would have had to be deliberately obtuse not to notice it, and she was not obtuse. He was careful. He was respectful. He maintained a distance that she recognized as intentional. But sometimes, when she was looking at something else, she would feel his gaze and look up and catch the edge of it before he redirected it to whatever was in front of him. She thought about Thomas. She thought about Thomas every day still, in the way you think about someone who has become part of the structure of your interior life. She did not think about him with the raw, immediate grief of the first weeks anymore. It had settled into something that was still present but not incapacitating, a permanent tenderness in the left side of her chest, an awareness of absence. She was not done with her grief, and she did not know when she would be. But she was 28 years old and she was still here, still living, and the prairie wind still smelled like green things in the spring, and Harlan Bishop had a way of listening to her talk that made her feel as though every word she said was worth considering. She was beginning to suspect that practical thinking was not going to get her all the way through this particular situation. On a Saturday in early May, a man named Cal Fremont rode out to the farm. Anna did not know Cal Fremont well, but she knew him by reputation, and his reputation was not good. He was a stockman who had bought up 3 failed farms in the county over the past 2 years, each time at a price considerably below what the land was worth, and he had done it by being present at the right moment when the right person had run out of choices. He was 45, thick through the shoulders, and he had a smile that preceded his actual intentions by just enough to make you distrust it. He arrived on a Saturday morning when Harlan was not there, and Anna came to the door and did not invite him in. "Mrs. Vaughn," he said pleasantly, "I heard your situation got resolved. Glad to hear it." "Good morning, Mr. Fremont," Anna said. "I have been thinking about this piece of land out here," Fremont said. "I know you have had a difficult season. Running a place like this alone is a serious undertaking." "I am managing," Anna said. "I am sure you are," he said. "I am sure you are doing your best. But a woman alone, with a note like that barely cleared, it seems to me a practical person might consider whether holding on to this particular 160 acres is the wisest course. Are you making an offer, Mr. Fremont?" He named a number. It was $160 below what Anna knew the land was worth, even in the current market. "That is a low offer," she said. He smiled the smile that preceded things. "Prices on agricultural land out here have been soft this spring. I am being generous considering the circumstances." "The circumstances being that you think I am still desperate," Anna said. The smile adjusted itself slightly. "I think you are a realistic woman," he said. "I am," Anna said, "which is why I am not selling you my farm." "Good morning, Mr. Fremont." She closed the door. She stood with her back against the door for a moment, her heart beating a little faster than usual, and then she went back to the kitchen and made herself a cup of tea and sat down at the table. She had handled it. She had handled it cleanly. But she was aware, in a way she had not been aware before, of how much of her security rested on her own nerve and her own will, and on the kindness of a man she had known for 3 weeks who had paid her debts for reasons that were decent but who had no obligation to continue being part of her life. She needed to think seriously about the farm, about the summer crop, about what she could reasonably do alone and what she could not, about whether she could afford to hire help, and if so, who. Harlan arrived at mid-afternoon to find her sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper covered in numbers, and he could read her face well enough by now to know something had happened. She told him about Fremont. She told it plainly, without embellishment. Harlan sat down across from her and looked at the numbers on her paper. "What do you have planted?" he asked. 40 acres of winter wheat that Thomas put in before he died," she said. "It looks fair. If we get decent rain in May, it will be a reasonable harvest." "What else?" "I was going to try corn on the east field if I could afford the seed. And I have the kitchen garden. The milk cows bring in a little." He was quiet, looking at the paper, and she let him look. "If you bring in the wheat," he said slowly, "and if you are willing to work the corn, I mean real work, hard summer work." "I know what farm work is," she said, with the mild sharpness of someone who has been underestimated slightly. The corner of his mouth moved. "I know you do," he said. "I'm saying that if you do it and if you have help with the labor, you could clear enough this season to put the farm on stable footing. Fremont would have nothing to come back to." "I cannot afford to hire hands," she said. "I know," he said. "I was not talking about hired hands." She looked at him. He met her eyes and held them without flinching, and there it was again, that directness that had no performance in it, that was simply the face of a man saying what he meant. "You are going north," she said carefully. "I have been going north for 5 weeks," he said. "I have not moved particularly quickly." She could feel the shape of something in the air between them. She could feel it the way you feel weather changing, not yet arrived but coming, the atmosphere different in a way that meant something. "Mr. Bishop," she said. "Harlan," he said quietly. It was the first time he had offered his given name. She held the word for a moment. "Harlan," she said, "I want to be honest with you." "I would prefer that," he said. "I am still a woman in mourning," she said. "I am not done with what Thomas's death cost me, and I do not know when I will be. I am not in a position to be anything except exactly what I am right now, which is a woman trying to keep her farm and keep her footing." "I understand that," he said, "and I want to be equally honest that I am not entirely sure what you are doing here," she said. "I am not sure what this is, what you are offering." He thought for a moment, that careful thinking that was the thing she had come to rely on in him. "What I am offering today is help with your farm," he said. "That is all I am offering. What else there might be, that is a question I have no right to put to you now, and I won't." She looked at him. She looked at his hands on the table, broad, scarred hands with the kind of competence written into them that comes from years of real work, and she looked at his face, which was honest. "Then I appreciate the help," she said. "Thank you." He nodded once and looked back at her paper of numbers, and they spent the next hour going through the farming plan for the season. May came in with rain, which was a mercy. The winter wheat had put in good roots, and the April warmth had pushed it up green, and even across the 40 acres. Anna and Harlan plowed the east field together over 4 days, switching between the 2 old plow horses she had and working from before sunup to after sundown, because the planting window for corn was narrow in this part of Kansas, and they both knew it. It was during those 4 days that the distance between them changed. Not dramatically, not with anything that could be pointed to as a specific moment, but in the way that working alongside someone through real labor changes you. Your guard goes down because it has to, because there is not enough energy to maintain it when you are also trying to turn 2 acres a day with tired horses and soil that still has stones in it from the ice of January. She started calling him Harlan without thinking about it. He started calling her Anna without asking. One evening at the end of the 2nd day of plowing, they were at the well drawing water for the horses, and she was so tired that, when she tried to lift the 2nd bucket, she simply could not make her arms do it. And she sat down in the dirt beside the well without meaning to, and laughed. Not the polite, social laugh she had used in company over the past hard months, but a real one, surprised out of her by the absurdity of her own body giving out. Harlan took the bucket without comment and watered both horses and then sat down in the dirt beside her, which she had not expected at all. He had his hat off, and his hair was damp with the day's work. "I have not laughed like that in months," she said when she had recovered herself. "Good," he said. "It was not a particularly dignified moment," she said. "No," he agreed. "It was a good one, though." She looked at him sideways. "Do you ever say anything you do not entirely mean?" "Not if I can help it," he said. "I have noticed that," she said. "I like it." He turned his head slightly to look at her, and in the evening light his eyes were darker and more present than usual, and she held his gaze for a moment longer than she would have a week ago. "Anna," he said, just her name, nothing attached to it. "I know," she said, because she did. They sat in the dirt by the well in the Kansas evening until the light went completely and the first stars appeared, and neither of them said anything that required words. In June, the wheat came in. It was not the grandest harvest the county had ever seen, but it was solid and it was real, and when Anna stood at the edge of the field and looked at the gold of it against the blue sky, she felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for 8 months. They cut it together with 2 additional men from town that Harlan had arranged, paying them fairly from the small reserve Anna had kept back from selling a heifer in the spring. The work took 5 days and left Anna sunburned and aching in muscles she had forgotten she had and possessed of a deep, fundamental satisfaction she had not expected. On the evening of the 5th day, when the grain had been cut and bundled, and the hired men had been paid and ridden back to town, Anna and Harlan sat on the porch together as the light went down, and she poured them both a glass of the good whiskey that Thomas had kept for occasions, and she had been saving without knowing what occasion it was for. "To a good harvest," she said. "To a good harvest," he said. They drank, and the whiskey was warm, and the evening was warm, and the crickets had started up in the grass, and Anna said without looking at him, "I need to ask you something." "All right," he said. "In September, when the corn comes in and the season is settled, are you going north?" He was quiet for long enough that she turned to look at him. He was looking at the horizon with the expression she had learned to read as serious deliberation rather than absence. "I have been thinking about that," he said. "What have you been thinking?" He set his glass down on the porch rail and turned to face her properly, and she faced him properly in return, because if this was going to be the conversation it seemed to be becoming, they were going to have it facing each other. "I have been thinking that north was not a destination so much as a direction I was moving in," he said. "I have been thinking that I have been moving in some direction or another since I was 17 years old, and I have never stayed anywhere long enough to know what it would feel like. And," she said, "and I find that I am not as certain about north as I was 6 weeks ago," he said. The crickets were very loud in the quiet that followed. "Harlan," she said, "I told you in May that I was not ready." "You did," he said. "I respected that." "I am telling you now," she said carefully, "that in May I was not ready. That was true." He watched her face with that careful, complete attention. "And now," he said, and his voice was so precisely what it always was, low and unhurried, never asking for more than was being given, that it made her heart do something large and inconvenient. "And now I am afraid," she said. "Of what?" "Of wanting things again," she said. "Of letting something matter again. Because the last time something mattered the way Thomas mattered to me, I lost it, and it was—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "It was very hard," she said. "I am afraid of that." "I know," he said quietly. "But I am also," she said, "growing quite tired of being afraid of it." The night was very still around them. The stars were out in that extravagant, thick way they got in Kansas in June. No city light to compete with them, just the full dark dome of the sky doing its most spectacular work. "I am 36 years old," Harlan said, and she noticed that he had not tried to diminish what she had said or redirect it, just acknowledged it and then spoken from his own honest ground. "I have not been a man who stayed in one place. I have not been a man who let himself belong somewhere. And I want to tell you that I did not plan this. I did not ride out to your farm 6 weeks ago with any intention other than the one I told you, which was that I could not ride past what Dodd was doing. That was true. I believed you," she said. "But I am here," he said. "I am here, and I have been here, and I would like—" He stopped, and this was the only time she had ever seen him search for words, which made her pay close attention. "I would like, very much, to have the right to sit on this porch with you," he said. "I would like to have the right to still be here at the end of the corn harvest, and at the first frost, and at the first snow. I would like to have the right to be the person you call when something breaks. I'm not asking you to stop being afraid. I would just like the right to be present while you are." Anna looked at him for a long time. Then she reached across the small distance between their chairs and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand over and his fingers closed around hers with the same steadiness he brought to everything. And she thought that she had perhaps never in her life felt something quite so much like solid ground. "I think," she said, "that you probably have that right." The summer moved through them like a song played slowly, each measure distinct and present. The corn grew green and tall in the east field, and Anna and Harlan moved around each other with an increasing ease that felt like learning a language you had suspected you already knew. He still slept at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house in Caldwell, because propriety was a real and living thing in 1879, and Anna had no interest in giving the town any more spectacle than it had already been provided with. But he was at the farm nearly every day, and on the days he was not, because he had contracted work training a remuda for a ranch 40 miles east, she noticed his absence in the way you notice a quiet that has become comfortable before it is interrupted. She noticed other things too. She noticed that when he was working near her, he was aware of her in a way that was not intrusive. She could feel his attention without it crowding her. She noticed that he remembered small things she had said days or weeks before and folded them quietly into conversation, not to demonstrate that he had been listening, but because he had been, and it simply showed. She noticed that he had a genuine tenderness toward animals that he would never have described as tenderness, but that she could see clearly in the way he moved around horses and even around George the mule, who had bitten 2 of the Caldwell men who had helped with the harvest, and who had never bitten Harlan once. "George likes you," she said one morning. "George tolerates me," Harlan said. "There is a difference. He bit the pastor last month," she said. "Pastor Greer had his hands in George's grain bucket," Harlan said. "That is a fair grievance." She laughed, and he looked at her with the expression that she had come to understand was the expression he wore when he was happy and was doing very little to prevent it from showing. On a July evening when the heat had broken slightly and they had been sitting on the porch reading, she had a letter from her mother. He had a 3-week-old copy of a St. Louis newspaper that he had found at the general store. He put the paper down and looked at her with something in his face she had not seen quite like this before. "Anna," he said. She looked up from the letter. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you answer I will respect it fully." She put the letter down. "All right," she said. "I have been thinking," he said, "about whether I want to continue moving from place to place." And she said, because she had learned that and was the best response to his kind of thinking. "I have some money put by," he said. "Enough to make a decent start. I know horses, I know land, I know how to work." He stopped for a moment, gathering the thing he wanted to say precisely. "I have been wondering whether 160 acres is the right size for this operation, or whether it might be expandable, whether the 2 fields east of yours along the creek might come available, and whether between the 2 of us we might be able to make something that was built to last." She was very still. "Are you talking about farming?" she said. "I am talking about everything," he said quietly. She set her mother's letter on the porch rail carefully, as though she were setting something fragile down. Her heart was doing that large, inconvenient thing again. She had become somewhat accustomed to it. "Harlan," she said. "I know it is soon," he said. "I know there are things you are still carrying. I am not asking you to put them down. I am asking if there is room for me alongside them." She thought about Thomas. She did this consciously, deliberately. She thought of his face and his voice and the particular way he had laughed in the 8 years they had had together, the good years and the hard ones and the simple, ordinary ones which she now understood had been the best. She carried him and she would carry him. He had been hers and she had been his, and that did not disappear. But she was sitting on the porch of the farm she had fought to keep in the Kansas summer evening, and across from her was a man she had come to trust so completely it sometimes frightened her, a man who looked at her as though she were the thing he had been moving toward without knowing it, and she thought that love was not a resource that depleted, that you could hold one person in your heart without it meaning there was no room for another, that the heart was not a fixed space but a growing one. "Yes," she said, "there is room." He was quiet for a moment, absorbing that. "Anna," he said, "I would like to court you properly, if you will allow it." "I thought that was what you had been doing for 2 months," she said. "I thought so too," he said, "but I wanted to say it plainly." "You always say things plainly," she said. "I try to," he said. "Yes," she said again. "I will allow it. I allow it very much." The smile that arrived on his face was the fullest she had seen from him, unhurried and genuine and entirely unguarded, the smile of a man who had not smiled like that in some time and had perhaps forgotten he was capable of it. July moved into August, and August was serious, the corn needing attention and the Kansas sun offering no mercy. They worked the field together in the mornings before the worst of the heat, and in the evenings when it broke. And in the midday they took their respite, and Harlan would sometimes stay for the noon meal, and they would sit in the kitchen with the windows open, and the breeze moving through, and talk about everything and nothing. And Anna found that she could not remember the last time she had felt so much like herself. He had taken to reading to her sometimes in the evenings, from whatever was at hand, the newspaper, a history of the Louisiana Territory she had on her shelf, once a seed catalog, which had made her laugh so hard she had spilled her tea. He had a good reading voice, low and measured, and she liked the sound of it in the quiet of the farm. He had also, without making any announcement of it, apparently spoken to Margaret Holt about whether there were any additional acres available along the East Creek. Margaret, who knew everyone's business as a matter of professional necessity, had information, and she gave it to him on a Tuesday. And on that Thursday, Harlan came to the farm with the information that the 80 acres east of Anna's property, along Bear Creek, belonged to a man named Whitfield who had gone back to Ohio the previous year, and had been trying to sell through an agent in Topeka for 8 months with no takers. "I made an offer through the agent," Harlan said. "It is a fair offer. If he accepts, those 80 acres properly worked could carry a horse operation and expand the crop rotation significantly." Anna looked at him across the kitchen table. "You are building something," she said. "I am hoping to," he said, "if you want to build it with me." "I thought we had established that," she said. "I wanted to be sure I was not presuming," he said. She reached across the table and took his hand, which she had begun to do without ceremony, and he looked at her hand in his with that quality of attention he gave to things he found important. "Harlan," she said, "you are not presuming." Whitfield accepted the offer in mid-August. Harlan received the letter from the Topeka agent on a Friday and rode out to the farm with it, and Anna read it and looked up at him and said, without planning to, "You should not be riding back to town." He held her gaze. "The neighbors would talk," he said carefully. "The neighbors talked in March when I was put on an auction block," she said. "I have revised my concern for their opinions somewhat." He looked at her with that dark, steady gaze that had the quality of a question he was asking without speaking it. "I am not saying," she began, and then stopped and started again. "I mean that you have been riding back to that boarding house every evening for 3 months, and we both know this farm is where you are, not that room at Mrs. Patterson's. I'm not suggesting impropriety. I'm suggesting that the barn loft is empty, and there is a perfectly good cot that Thomas used to use in the summer when he was working late, and you do not have to ride 8 miles in the dark simply because it is the expected thing." He was quiet for a moment. "Are you sure?" he said. "Harlan," she said, "I am a woman who has been on an auction block. I have very little interest in performing propriety for an audience that was not there to help me. What I am interested in is you not falling off your horse on the road back to town because you are tired at the end of a long day." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said very quietly, "All right." He moved his things from Mrs. Patterson's the following week and took the barn loft room, and this was an arrangement that was entirely decent and that Anna felt certain about. And if Margaret Holt had opinions, she was wise enough to keep them behind the counter of the dry goods store. September came in cool, and they brought in the corn together. 2 good weeks of hard work that left the barn storeroom satisfying and full. Anna sat down with her paper of numbers one evening and added up the season and discovered that she was, for the first time since Thomas had gotten sick, genuinely solvent. More than solvent. She had money to carry them through the winter, money to buy the seed for spring, money to put away against the next hard year. She sat with this knowledge for a while, feeling its weight, which was the weight of security, and it was a good weight. Then she looked up at Harlan, who was cleaning his bridle at the other end of the kitchen table, and said, "We had a good season." "We did," he said, without looking up from the bridle. "The farm is clear," she said. "The debt is clear. We have provision through the winter." He looked up then, and she could see that he understood what she was telling him, not just the numbers, but what the numbers meant, which was that she was standing on her own ground with both feet now and had been for some time. "Congratulations," he said, and he meant it entirely. "I would not have managed this without you," she said. "You might have," he said. "I might have," she agreed. "It would have been harder and lonelier, and I am glad I did not have to find out." He set the bridle down. "Anna," he said. "I know," she said. "I know what you are going to ask." "Do you?" "You are going to ask me to marry you," she said. "And I want you to know that I have been thinking about it since July." He looked at her with the directness that she had come to love, which was the particular word she had used in her own mind and was no longer surprised by. Love. It had arrived the way things arrived in her life, practically, quietly, undeniably. "What have you been thinking?" he asked. "I have been thinking, yes," she said, "for a considerable time." He stood up from the table and came around it to her side, and she stood as well, and he was taller than her by nearly a head, and she tilted her face up to look at him, and his hands came up to hold her face, very gently, the way you hold something you do not want to break, and he kissed her. It was the first time. It was quiet and warm and absolutely certain, the way he was absolutely certain in everything he did, and she put her hands against his chest and felt his heartbeat, which was not as steady as he generally appeared. And she was glad of that, because it told her that he was not as unmoved as he sometimes seemed, that this mattered to him in the deep and serious way that she had needed it to matter. When they separated, he was looking at her with the full, unguarded face of a man who had come home. "Marry me," he said. It was not precisely a question. It was a man stating the thing he wanted most and also asking for it. "Yes," she said. "With my whole heart, Harlan, yes." They were married by Pastor Greer in the first week of October 1879, in a ceremony that was small and genuine, and attended by Margaret Holt and two other women from town who had been quietly, consistently kind to Anna during the hard months, and by a man named Cord Whitley, who had been Harlan's friend for 10 years and who had come from Dodge City for the occasion, and who wept openly during the vows, which he denied afterward with great energy. Anna wore the blue dress, the good one, and she had sewn new white cuffs on it and bought a length of ivory ribbon from the dry goods store, and Margaret had helped her arrange her hair. When she came down the church aisle, she was looking at Harlan at the front of the church, and the expression on his face when he saw her was something she thought she would keep for the rest of her life. The expression of a man who was not prepared for how beautiful she was, or perhaps had been preparing for it, and was still not prepared enough. The ceremony was short. The vows were the traditional ones, and Anna said them in the full knowledge of what they meant. She had promised these things before, and she had meant them then, and she meant them now, both times and both men, and she did not think there was any contradiction in that. Love was not a single event. It was a repeated choice, made every day in the small, irreplaceable things. Harlan said his vows without looking away from her once, and his voice was the same as always, low and even, and she could see in his eyes the enormous, carefully held feeling that the even voice was carrying. Cord Whitley cried into his handkerchief. They went home to the farm together as husband and wife on a cool October evening when the sky was clear, and the stars were extremely present, and they walked through the front door of the farmhouse that had been Anna's, that would now be theirs, and stood in the kitchen where they had eaten 100 meals together and read to each other, and argued mildly about planting schedules, and sat in the good silence that two people create when they have stopped needing to perform for each other. "Well," said Harlan. "Well," said Anna. She crossed the kitchen to him and put her arms around him, and his came around her, and they stood like that in the lamplight for a long time without saying anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. The winter of 1879 and 1880 was the kind of Kansas winter that tests a person's philosophical relationship with the idea of living on the plains. It came in cold and stayed cold and added snow in quantities that had Anna and Harlan both spending hours each day simply managing the livestock, keeping the water from freezing, keeping the barn warm enough, keeping the paths to the well clear. George the mule was indignant about the snow in a way that seemed almost personal, as though he suspected someone was responsible and was working out who. But they were warm in the farmhouse. Harlan had spent October reinforcing the ceiling on the windows and adding a second layer of insulation to the walls of the main room, a foresight that proved its worth in January. They had enough wood, enough food, enough lamp oil. They spent the long winter evenings reading and talking, and sometimes simply being quiet together in the way that Anna had come to understand was one of the best things about loving Harlan Bishop, the quality of his silences, which were never empty, never cold, always present. She told him about her childhood in Ohio, about her father's mill and the Ohio River in summer, and the way her mother smelled of lavender even in winter. He told her things he had not told anyone about Missouri, about his father, about the 2 years in the army that he had mentioned and set aside, and that she gently returned to one February evening when the snow was deep outside, and the fire was warm, and it seemed like the right time for things that had been held a long time. He told her about the Red River, about what he had seen there, about a specific day in June 1862 that he had carried with him for 17 years like a stone in his chest. She listened without interrupting, and when he was finished she crossed the room and sat beside him and put her head against his shoulder, and he was very still for a moment, and then he leaned against her and she could feel him breathe. "You have been carrying that alone for a long time," she said. "It was mine to carry," he said. "It is still yours," she said. "You do not have to hand it to me, but you can carry it in front of me now." He put his arm around her and she could feel something shift in him, not the stone going away. She did not think it went away, but the quality of it changing, becoming something shared, and she thought that was what the winter was for, among other things. In March, Anna realized she was pregnant. She discovered this through the particular combination of symptoms and calendar observation that a woman conducts privately before she is ready to say the thing out loud, and she was certain of it before she told Harlan, because she wanted to be sure before she saw the expression on his face, because she suspected she would not want to look away from it once it appeared, and she wanted to be giving him true information. She told him on a Tuesday morning at the kitchen table, before he had finished his first cup of coffee, which was perhaps not the most strategic timing. She said it directly, as she said everything, and watched his face. The expression was what she had suspected. It was larger than anything she had words for, not a loud expression, because he was never loud but profound, the face of a man to whom something has happened that he has wanted for longer than he knew. He set his coffee cup down very carefully. "Anna," he said. "I know," she said, and she was smiling so broadly it was making her face hurt. He came around the table and lifted her out of her chair and held her against him, which was not something he did dramatically or demonstratively, generally, and the fact that he did it now without any of his customary reserve told her everything she needed to know about how thoroughly this mattered to him. "Are you well?" he said into her hair. "I am very well," she said. "I am wonderful, actually." He held her for a long time. George the mule banged against the barn wall outside, impatient about breakfast, and neither of them moved for another full minute. The spring of 1880 was kind to them. The Whitfield acres east of the creek were being put to work. Harlan having contracted with 2 other ranches in the county to train their horses, and having begun building a proper training corral on the new land. The new operation was small but genuine, and there was already a reputation building for Harlan Bishop's horse work in the county, a reputation made of the particular currency of results, of a rancher returning to pick up a horse that had been unmanageable in October and was now reliable in April. Anna managed the farm side and her kitchen garden and the accounts, which she was good at, and she felt the baby grow through April and May and into the warm June. Her body did its ancient, ordinary, extraordinary work, and she led it, and Harlan was nearby with the same steadiness he brought to everything. And she thought sometimes about the March morning 14 months ago when she had stood on that auction block with her eyes on the horizon and felt the full weight of having run out of road. She thought about it without bitterness. The bitterness had been there for a while, she would be honest about that, a hot, low anger at Cyrus Dodd and at the law that had enabled him and at the crowd that had watched in silence. She had not been wrong to be angry. The thing that had been done to her had been unjust, a legal mechanism deployed against a grieving woman who had no power, and the injustice of it was real regardless of how it had ended. She thought it would be a mistake to let the good ending make her forget the injustice of the process, because there were other women in counties all across the West who stood on similar platforms and did not have a man in the back of the crowd who paid the full price and sent them home. But she had found, somewhere in the second winter, that the anger had settled into something more useful, a clear-eyed understanding of what the world could do and what she could do in return, which was to live well and to build something real and to love her husband and their farm, and whatever came next without apology. What came next in the first week of July 1880 was a son. He arrived at 4 in the morning on a Tuesday, assisted by Dr. Harmon from Caldwell, who had ridden out through a light summer rain, and by Margaret Holt, who had insisted on coming and whose insistence had been entirely correct, because she was the most practically capable person in the room, and everyone, including Dr. Harmon, was grateful for her. Harlan was outside the bedroom door for 4 hours, and when Dr. Harmon opened the door and told him he had a son, Anna heard from inside the room a sound she had never heard from Harlan before, which was the sound of a man completely undone. He came in and she was exhausted, and the baby was red and improbably small, and she held him up and looked at Harlan, who was looking at the two of them with an expression that she thought she would spend the rest of her life being glad she had been present to see. "Come here," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed and she put the baby in his arms, and he held his son with the same careful competence he brought to everything, but there was something entirely new in his face, a tenderness he had not shown before to anything, and the baby looked up at him with the unfocused but serious gaze of the very newly arrived. "Hello," Harlan said to his son, very quietly, just that. "Hello." Anna leaned her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes, and listened to the summer rain on the roof of the farmhouse that was hers and Harlan's, and now this small new person's. And she thought that she had not known, standing on that platform in the cold March of 1879, that she was also standing on the edge of this, on the edge of Harlan Bishop's quiet voice from the back of the crowd, on the edge of a summer full of corn and fences, on the edge of this particular Tuesday morning. This particular small, warm weight in her husband's arms. They named the boy James Thomas Bishop. James for Harlan's grandfather, who had been a good man, Harlan said, and Thomas for a man who had talked about his wife every night around a campfire on the Kishom Trail, who had said that she had made curtains before the walls were finished because she wanted it to feel like home. James Thomas Bishop was a healthy, loud, opinionated infant who had his father's eyes and his mother's stubbornness, and who held Harlan's finger in his small fist with a grip that seemed to Harlan, as he would say later, unreasonably strong for someone that knew. The summer and fall of 1880 arranged themselves around the baby and the farm and the new horse operation with a kind of ordered, organic fullness. Cord Whitley, Harlan's friend from Dodge City, came to visit in August and stayed for 3 weeks, ostensibly to help with the horse training. Actually, Anna suspected, because he had been lonely in Dodge City and was in love with the idea of what Harlan and Anna had built, the warm and working life of it. He was excellent company and terrible at cards, which he and Harlan played in the evenings while Anna fed the baby, and listened to them argue amiably about hands that had been played incorrectly. "You did that on purpose," Cord said one evening, looking at Harlan over his cards. "I play badly," Harlan said. "You play badly deliberately," Cord said. "I have figured this out." Harlan looked at him with the expression he wore when he was containing a smile. "You have been losing to me for 10 years, Cord said. "I thought I was simply better." "You are not better," Harlan said. Anna laughed from the rocking chair and James stirred and settled. Cord stayed until September, and when he left he shook Harlan's hand and said, "I am going to find something like this." And Harlan said, "You should." And Cord got on his horse and rode south toward Dodge City with the look of a man who had been given something to aim for. The harvest of 1880 was the best the farm had seen. The East Fields and the Whitfield acres together produced a quantity that required 2 days of hauling to the grain exchange, and resulted in the most satisfying ledger entry Anna had ever written. Harlan trained 17 horses that season, his reputation having spread to 3 additional counties, and there were letters waiting in Caldwell requesting his services for the following spring. They hired 2 hands for the spring planting of 1881, young men from town, brothers named Samuel and Peter Kraft, who were 19 and 22, and who were good workers, and who were visibly a little intimidated by both Anna and Harlan in a way that was respectful and appropriate, and which made the working of the expanded farm considerably easier. James Bishop spent his first year learning that the world was made of interesting objects, and that all of them could be reached if you were sufficiently motivated, a lesson he applied with exhausting consistency. He pulled himself upright against the kitchen table legs at 9 months and took his first steps at 11 months, crossing the kitchen floor with the expression of a man crossing a river, entirely focused, slightly offended by the difficulty, absolutely committed to the other side. Harlan sat on the kitchen floor and watched this with the full attention he gave to important things, and caught his son when he fell, which was often, and set him upright and let him try again. Anna watched both of them from the doorway and felt the size of her happiness as a physical thing, as large and present as the Kansas sky. Cal Fremont came by the farm one more time, in the spring of 1881. He came alone this time, without the pleasant preceded by warning smile, and he found not Anna alone at the kitchen door, but Anna and Harlan together at the corral, working with a bay mare whose previous owners had treated her poorly, and who was only now, after 2 months, beginning to trust. He looked at the expanded property, the new corral, the Whitfield acres with their fencing, the 2 good hands working in the East Field, the farmhouse with its solid, maintained look of a place that was genuinely cared for, and he looked at Anna and Harlan, and whatever calculation he had come to run was clearly not computing the way he had expected. "Mr. and Mrs. Bishop," he said. "Mr. Fremont," Harlan said pleasantly, which was the word that meant something quite precise when Harlan said it. Fremont looked at him with the assessment of a man who is working out whether the man in front of him is manageable, and arriving at his answer. "I see you have expanded," he said. "We have," Harlan said. "I had wondered whether there might be an interest in selling the northern 20 acres, Fremont said. "There is not," Anna said from beside Harlan, in the tone she used when she had said a thing and meant it to be the last time she said it. Fremont looked at her and then at Harlan, and whatever he saw in either of their faces resolved the question fully. He nodded, touched his hat, and rode away. Harlan watched him go and then looked at Anna with the almost smile. "You enjoyed that," she said. "Somewhat," he said. She laughed, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her since that first breakfast at the kitchen table, when she had been a woman trying to find solid ground, and he had been a man who had been moving in one direction or another for 19 years, and had not yet found the place where he wanted to stop. In the late summer of 1881, when James was walking confidently and talking in the two-word combinations that made his parents repeat them to each other at dinner as though they were poetry, more horse, and no George, and one memorable morning, Daddy stay, which had stopped Harlan completely in the kitchen doorway and made Anna have to look out the window for a moment. Anna realized she was pregnant again. She told Harlan in the evening, same as before, and the expression was the same, large and certain and entirely unguarded. "Two," he said. "Two," she confirmed. He kissed her forehead and her temple and the side of her face, and she put her arms around him, and outside the kitchen window the Kansas evening was doing its most extravagant skywork, gold and orange and the particular deep blue that came just before full dark, and James was asleep in his room, and George was settled in the barn, and the two young Kraft brothers had gone home for the evening, and it was quiet and warm and entirely, specifically, particular theirs. The baby arrived in the first week of April 1882, with considerably more speed than her brother had managed. Dr. Harmon barely arriving in time and Margaret Holt absolutely arriving in time, having apparently developed a sense for these things. She was a girl, round and dark-haired and immediately possessed of a furious dignity, and James, who had been allowed to meet her while Harlan held him carefully in the bedroom doorway, looked at her with an expression of enormous scientific interest and said, "Small." "She will get bigger," Harlan told him. James considered this. "More small," he decided, and this was the sentence of 1882, repeated at dinner by both his parents, and which would be told to his sister when she was old enough to appreciate it. They named her Clara Ruth Bishop. Clara because Anna had always loved the name, clean and clear, and Ruth because it was Harlan's mother's name, the one good thing from Missouri, the one he had kept. Clara Ruth Bishop entered the world with opinions, and she never really stopped having them. The spring of 1882 was the most beautiful Anna could remember. Not because anything dramatically different happened, but because of the particular quality of it. The way the green came up across the Kansas plain in April with that shocking, insistent aliveness. The way the farm looked in the morning light. The fields and the corrals and the house with its good walls and its curtained windows. The way Harlan moved through it all with the easy competence of a man who knew exactly where he was. She watched him one morning in April, the baby asleep against his chest while he stood at the corral fence, one hand resting on the top rail, watching Samuel Kraft work with a young gelding. James was at his feet attempting to climb the fence and being periodically retrieved. The light was coming from the east, and Harlan's profile was steady and certain against it, and Anna stood on the porch with her second cup of coffee, and watched him, and thought about the story of how they had come to this moment, the auction block, and the silence, and the man in the back of the crowd who had not raised his voice. She had thought a great deal over the past 3 years about the particular quality of what Harlan had done. It had not been heroic in the loud sense. He had not burst through doors or made speeches or challenged anyone to anything. He had simply been a man who could not ride past an injustice and who had addressed it in the most direct, practical, quiet way available to him. He had paid the debt. He had sent her home, and then he had come back the next day to fix the barn door. That was the thing, she thought. That was the thing about Harlan Bishop. Not the grand gesture, though the gesture of paying $432 was significant, but the coming back. The barn door. The fences and the plowing and the evenings on the porch, and the hand offered without explanation, and the patience. The extraordinary, genuine patience of a man who understood that the most important things were the ones you showed up for every single day. He turned and found her watching him, and something in his face opened the way it always did when he looked at her. And he shifted the baby slightly, and raised his free hand in the small, specific gesture that meant "come here" when he said it with his hands. She set her coffee cup on the porch rail and went. By 1883, the Bishop Farm, which was what people in Caldwell had begun to call it, a name that would be on the county maps by 1885, encompassed the original 160 acres, the Whitfield 80, and an additional 40 that Harlan had purchased from the estate of a rancher named Prout who had died without heirs. The horse training operation had a full season of contracts and a waiting list. The Kraft brothers were permanent employees now, and there was a fourth person, a woman named Dory Whitman who helped Anna in the house 3 days a week, a quiet and competent woman whose husband had worked one of the cattle ranches east of town. James was 3 and Clara was 1, and the farmhouse that had been built for 2 was now lived in by 4, and there were discussions in the kitchen in the evenings about what could be added where, because the children's room, which had been the sewing room, was going to require a dressing. Harlan built the addition in the fall of 1883. He built it himself, with help from the Kraft brothers and from Cord Whitley, who arrived from Dodge City in September with a grin and a tool belt, and the information that he had married a woman named Louise in June and was going to make her come out and see this farm because he needed her to understand what he was attempting to build. Louise Whitley arrived in October, a small, sharp-eyed woman from Tennessee who assessed the Bishop farm and its occupants with the efficiency of someone who did not have time to waste on imprecise opinions, and concluded, apparently within the first afternoon, that it was excellent, that Anna was a woman of considerable quality, and that her husband had been correct about everything he had said, which she delivered to Cord with the air of someone granting a significant concession. They built the addition in 10 days, and it was solid and warm, and James declared it his by the simple expedient of dragging his blanket into it before it was technically finished and installing himself in the corner, and since no one had the heart to move him, it became his. The winter of 1883 was the 4 of them in the expanded farmhouse, with Harlan's additions, holding the cold out, and the fire holding the warmth in, and 2 small children filling the quiet, with an astonishing variety of sounds and demands and small daily emergencies, and Anna and Harlan moving through all of it with the particular grace of 2 people who had found in each other the right balance. She with her practicality and her directness and her laugh that could arrive without warning. He with his steadiness and his care and his capacity to be completely present in the exact moment that needed him. There were hard things still. Life on the plains in the 1880s was not without its difficulties, and they did not pretend otherwise. The winter of 1884 was brutal, and they lost one of the milk cows and a good quarter horse, and 6 weeks of work to weather they simply could not control. There were years when the rain was wrong and years when the market was wrong and years when both were wrong simultaneously. Harlan had nightmares occasionally about the Red River, and Anna would wake when he did and put her hand on his back, and he would lie still for a while until the thing passed. But they moved through the hard things together with the same steadiness they brought to everything, and the farm held, and the children grew, and the life they had built was solid enough to carry what needed carrying. In the spring of 1885, Cyrus Dodd left Caldwell. Anna heard about it from Margaret Holt, who mentioned it with a particular satisfaction. The bank that had held Thomas's debt had changed ownership, and the new management had reviewed certain practices, with less tolerance for the gray legal spaces that Dodd had occupied so comfortably. He had not been charged with anything. The thing that had been done to Anna had been technically legal, which was its own kind of comment on the law, but he had been made aware that his services were no longer required, and he had departed for Wichita, where presumably there were other gray spaces. Anna received this information and thought about it for a while. "Are you glad?" Harlan asked her that evening. "I am," she said. "I would have preferred that what was done to me had been recognized as wrong at the time," she said. "I would have preferred that the law had prevented it rather than addressing it afterward. But yes, I am glad he is gone." "Me too," Harlan said quietly. She looked at him. "Did you say something to anyone about him?" He was quiet for a moment. "Harlan," she said. "I wrote to the new bank ownership," he said. When they took over the bank 2 years ago, I wrote to them and I told them what had been done to you and the legal mechanism that had been used, and I told them that I knew of 2 other women in the county who had been through similar arrangements. I told them what I knew factually. I did not ask them to do anything in particular. I thought they should have the information. She looked at him for a long time. You did not tell me you did that, she said. No, he said. I did not want it to be about what I had done. I did not want you to feel. I wanted it to be resolved on its own terms, not as a favor I had arranged. She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him and put her hands on either side of his face, which she did when she needed him to understand something directly. Harlan Bishop, she said, you are the best man I have ever known. He looked back at her with the dark, steady eyes she had been looking into for 6 years. I am a man who is trying to deserve you, he said. I am working on it. You have succeeded, she said. You succeeded a long time ago. I would like you to accept that. He turned his face and kissed her palm, which he did sometimes, and which she would never entirely get used to in the sense that it would always move something in her when he did it. All right, he said. I accept it. James was 5 in the summer of 1885, and Clara was 3, and the 2 of them had formed the particular alliance of siblings, full of cooperation and competition in equal measure, and they had between them colonized the entire farm in the way that children colonize space. Every corner and fence post and hay bale had a name and a significance known only to them, a private geography of childhood. James had his father's way with horses, a quiet and patient ease that George manifested with animals, and Harlan had begun taking him to the training corral to watch, which James approached with the gravity of a calling. Clara had her mother's way with words and had been overheard explaining to the cat, a large, indifferent animal named December who had arrived one winter and declined to leave the principles of crop rotation, with the authority of someone who had thought the matter through. On a Sunday afternoon in September 1885, Anna and Harlan sat on the porch in the same 2 chairs they had always used, in the same arrangement they had occupied on the evening 6 years ago when she had put her hand over his and everything had shifted. The farm was quiet in the late afternoon way, the hands gone home, the children napping, the horses settled. The prairie stretched out to the west in the long evening gold, and the sky was doing what the Kansas sky did best, which was everything at once. Anna had a letter in her lap from her mother in Ohio, who had recovered considerably over the past years and who wrote faithfully and who had, to Anna's great and quiet joy, agreed to come for Christmas that year, her first visit since Anna had gone west. She is coming, Anna said. Good, Harlan said. She asked in the last letter whether you are actually as quiet as I have made you sound, Anna said. What did you tell her? I told her you were exactly as quiet and exactly as present, which is to say you are the loudest quiet person I have ever known, she said. He looked at her with the almost smile that was more present now than it had ever been, worn down to something more open, like a path walked often. That is one of the more accurate things anyone has said about me, he said. She folded the letter and looked at the horizon and thought about how the prairie, which had seemed so large and indifferent to her in the first years, had become the frame she wanted around her life. The space of it, the sky of it, the particular quality of a Kansas evening that she had never experienced before she came west, and which now seemed to her like the natural condition of evening, the way evening was supposed to be. Do you ever regret not going north? She asked. He looked at her. When you were in the back of that crowd in 1879, she said, before you spoke, was there a part of you that was going to keep going? He thought about it honestly, the way he always thought about things. There was a moment, he said. I saw what was happening and I thought, this is not my trouble. I thought that for about 30 seconds. And then I thought that a man named Thomas Vaughn had told me about a woman who put up curtains before the walls were finished, he said. And I thought that no woman who would do that should be standing on a platform in the silence. And I thought that I had $432 and a conscience, and there was nothing north that was more important than both of those things. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the plain. "I am glad you thought that," she said. "So am I," he said. And then, after a moment, in the voice that still had the quality of a rifle shot, precise, carrying, unhurried, "Every single day, Anna. I am glad of it every single day." She reached across and took his hand, and his fingers closed around hers, and they sat together in the September evening on the porch of the farm they had built, with the children asleep inside, and the horses settled, and the fields resting after the season, and the great Kansas sky pouring its colors out in the west. And Anna Vaughn Bishop, who had stood on an auction block in silence, and found in that silence the voice of the man who would become the architecture of her life, held her husband's hand and watched the sun go down, and did not think about the past with anything except gratitude for what it had given and what it had taken, and for the specific and irreplaceable road it had set her on. The sun went all the way down in the way it did out here, without hesitation, painting everything it touched one last time before it let the dark in. The first stars appeared. The crickets started in the grass, just as they had on a June evening 6 years ago when she and Harlan had first sat on this porch and named the thing between them. Inside, Clara woke from her nap and called out in her imperative way, and James appeared a moment later in the doorway with the look of a child who has taken approximately enough nap and believes the world owes him an adventure. "Papa," he said. "Come here," Harlan said, and James crossed the porch and climbed into his father's lap with the ease of someone who has always found that particular lap to be exactly his size. And Harlan's arm came around him, and Anna looked at the two of them, and Clara called again, and she went inside to get her daughter and brought her out into the evening. And they were all four of them on the porch in the first dark of the September night, with the stars coming out one by one over the flat and faithful Kansas plain. There was no more silence in the way that March morning had been silent, the flat, pressing, uncomfortable silence of a crowd watching something they could not bring themselves to stop. This was a different kind of silence. This was the silence of fullness, of a life built deliberately, of two people who had found in each other the specific thing that made all the rest of the noise comprehensible. Anna leaned her head against Harlan's shoulder, Clara warm in her arms, James half asleep already against his father's chest, and she listened to the sound of the farm in the night, the soft movement of the horses, the wind in the Kansas grass, the ordinary miraculous quiet of a thing that is exactly what it is meant to be. It had started with a debt and a silence and a man who never raised his voice. It had become this. All of this, the children and the farm and the years and the love that had arrived quietly and stayed entirely, the way Harlan Bishop himself had arrived and stayed, the way she had understood from the very beginning was the particular and extraordinary quality of him. She pressed her lips to the top of Clara's head and felt Harlan's hand move to rest at the back of her neck, warm and certain, and she closed her eyes and let the evening hold them all. Outside the Bishop farm, the Kansas plain stretched west and south under the wide, star-filled sky of 1885, unhurried and ancient and entirely itself, and the four of them were small and significant against it, which was exactly the right proportion, small enough to be humble, significant enough to matter, held in the exact right place by the exact right things. Whatever the road had been, it had led here, and here, it turned out, was everything.